November 9th, 1989. 11:47 p.m. Moscow time. The phone rang with that particular insistence that government secure lines have metallic, urgent, impossible to ignore. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev sat alone in his Kremlin study, the room warm despite the November cold outside, heated by radiators that clanked and hissed like something alive. A desk lamp cast a circle of yellow light across papers covered in typed Cyrillic text and handwritten annotations in red ink. Beyond the tall windows, Red Square lay dark and empty, the cobblestones slick with rain that reflected the floodlights illuminating the Kremlin walls. He had been reading intelligence reports from East Germany for the past 2 hours, each one more alarming than the last. Demonstrations in Leipzig, 70,000 people. Dresden, 50,000. Chants of Wir sind das Volk, we are the people. The East German leadership paralyzed, uncertain, waiting for Moscow to tell them what to do, waiting for Moscow to send the tanks. Gorbachev lifted the receiver. His hand was steady, but there was a tightness in his chest that had been there for weeks now, a physical manifestation of the pressure that was crushing him from all sides. Dare. The voice belonged to Anatoly Chernyaev, his chief foreign policy advisor. Chernyaev was normally unflappable, a career diplomat who had seen everything, but tonight there was something in his voice, a tremor, barely perceptible, like a crack in ice. Mikhail Sergeyevich, something is happening in Berlin. The checkpoints, they're opening. People are crossing, thousands of them. The border guards don't know what to do. They're calling for instructions. Gorbachev said nothing. He could hear his own breathing, could hear the faint hiss of the secure line, could hear the distant sound of the Kremlin clock tower beginning to strike midnight. The sound echoed across Red Square, 12 solemn chimes marking the passage from one day to the next, from one world to another. How did this happen? His voice was calm, almost flat. It was a tone he had cultivated over years of political survival. Never show panic, never show weakness, never let them see you sweat. There was a press conference this evening. Günter Schabowski, he's on the Politburo, he announced new travel regulations, but he misread the memo, said they were effective immediately. The crowds heard it on television. They went to the checkpoints. The guards had no orders to stop them. Mikhail Sergeyevich, they opened the gates. For a moment, Gorbachev closed his eyes. In that darkness, he saw the entire architecture of the Cold War, 44 years of confrontation, of nuclear brinkmanship, of ideological struggle, pivoting on a bureaucratic mistake. A confused official reading the wrong line at a press conference, history turning on accident and incompetence, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, the barrier that had divided Europe for 28 years, that had divided families, that had killed hundreds who tried to cross it. Opening. Not through negotiation or policy or careful diplomatic maneuvering, but through chaos and confusion and the irresistible pressure of people who simply wanted to be free. What are our forces doing? Gorbachev asked. There was a pause. When Chernyaev spoke again, his voice was very quiet. Waiting for orders, the group of Soviet forces Germany has 380,000 troops in East Germany, 16 divisions, 5,000 tanks. They could close the checkpoints in an hour. They could seal the wall. They could restore order. But they need authorization from Moscow. They need to know. He hesitated. They need to know if we intervene. Do we intervene? 3 words. 3 simple words that contained the weight of history, the choice between 2 futures, the decision that would define Gorbachev's legacy and reshape the world. Do we send the tanks? The precedent was clear. For 40 years, Soviet control over Eastern Europe had been maintained through an implicit but absolute threat. Step out of line, and the tanks will come. Hungary, 1956. Gorbachev had been 25 years old, a young Communist Party member in Stavropol when the Hungarian Revolution erupted. He had followed it in Pravda, had read the official accounts of how fascist counter-revolutionaries had tried to overthrow socialism. It was only later, much later in the glasnost era, when honest discussion became possible, that he learned the truth, that the Hungarians had risen up demanding democracy and freedom, that Imre Nagy, their reformist leader, had declared neutrality and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, that Khrushchev had sent 60,000 troops and 1,000 tanks into Budapest, that 2,500 Hungarians had died in the fighting and another 200 were executed afterward, including Nagy himself, hanged after a secret trial. The message had been clear. Soviet control was non-negotiable. Czechoslovakia, 1968. Gorbachev had been 37, a regional party secretary, when Alexander Dubček introduced reforms in Prague. Socialism with a human face, they called it. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, political pluralism within the framework of socialism. It had seemed dangerous to Gorbachev at the time, a threat to socialist unity, a crack in the foundation that could bring the whole structure down. When Leonid Brezhnev sent 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops to Prague. In August 1968, Gorbachev had supported it. The Prague Spring ended with tanks in Wenceslas Square, with Dubček removed from power, with the reforms reversed, with the Czechoslovak people learning the same lesson the Hungarians had learned 12 years earlier. The system would defend itself, with force if necessary, with overwhelming force. The Brezhnev Doctrine had formalized this principle. The Soviet Union had the right, the duty, to intervene militarily in any socialist country where socialism itself was threatened. It was the iron law of the Soviet Empire. Loyalty would be rewarded with economic support and military protection. Defection would be crushed without mercy. East Germany was the crown jewel of that empire. It was the front line of the Cold War, the place where NATO and Warsaw Pact forces faced each other across minefields and barbed wire and concrete barriers. It was also the most economically successful socialist state. Proof that the communist system could work if properly implemented and rigorously enforced. The German Democratic Republic was not just another satellite. It was essential to Soviet security, Soviet prestige, Soviet identity. And the wall was its defining feature. Built in 1961 to stop the hemorrhage of East Germans fleeing to the West, 3 million had left between 1949 and 1961, draining the country of its most educated and productive citizens. The Berlin Wall had become the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with communism. A system so unattractive, so oppressive, so fundamentally flawed that it had to imprison its own citizens to prevent them from leaving. Every year, people died trying to cross it, shot by border guards, blown up by mines, torn apart by dogs. Every year, Western leaders denounced it. John F. Kennedy had stood at the wall in 1963 and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Ronald Reagan had stood at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and challenged Gorbachev directly. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Gorbachev had bristled at Reagan's words. The wall was not his creation. He had been a 30-year-old party functionary when it was built. But it had become his responsibility, his problem, his symbol of everything he was trying to reform. Now, in November 1989, it was opening. Not because Gorbachev had ordered it, not because of negotiation or policy, not because Reagan's challenge had been accepted, but because the system was collapsing from within, because the people were simply walking through, because history had reached a tipping point where the old order could no longer sustain itself. The question, the only question that mattered, was whether Gorbachev would try to stop them, whether he would be the next Soviet leader to send tanks into a European capital, whether he would write the next chapter of history in blood. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was not supposed to be a revolutionary. He was supposed to be a reformer, a modernizer, a man who would save the Soviet system by making it more efficient, more humane, more responsive to the needs of its people. Born in 1931 in Privolnoye, a small village in southern Russia, he had grown up during the worst years of Stalinist terror and the catastrophe of World War II. His grandfather had been arrested and tortured during the purges. His father had fought at the front. His village had been occupied by the Germans. He had seen poverty, hunger, violence, loss. But he had also seen the Soviet Union emerge victorious from the war, had seen it become a superpower, had believed, genuinely believed, in the communist project. He had joined the Communist Party at 20, studied law at Moscow State University, married Raisa, a philosophy student who would become his closest advisor and confidant. Rose through the party ranks in Stavropol, becoming regional first secretary at Forte. Moved to Moscow in 1978, joining the Central Committee. Survived the stagnation of the Brezhnev years, the brief tenures of Andropov and Chernenko. Emerged in March 1985 as General Secretary at the relatively young age of 54. He was different from his predecessors. He had traveled to the West, to France, to Canada, to Britain, where Margaret Thatcher had famously declared, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." He had seen how people lived in capitalist countries, the prosperity, the freedom, the innovation. He had understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the Soviet Union was falling catastrophically behind. The economy was stagnating. Technology was outdated. Living standards were declining. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and morale. The arms race with the United States was bankrupting the country. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 had exposed the rot at the heart of the system, the incompetence, the secrecy, the willingness to sacrifice human lives to maintain the illusion of Soviet superiority. Something had to change. The system had to be reformed, or it would collapse. Gorbachev introduced perestroika, restructuring, economic reforms to introduce market mechanisms, to allow private enterprise, to make the system more efficient and productive. He introduced glasnost, openness, freedom of speech and press within limits, the ability to discuss problems honestly, to criticize failures, to propose solutions. What he did not anticipate, what he could not have anticipated, was that glasnost would expose the fundamental lies on which the Soviet system was built. That once people were allowed to speak honestly, they would speak about everything: the failures, the corruption, the oppression, the crimes of Stalin, the incompetence of Brezhnev, the absurdity of communist ideology, the superiority of Western systems. That once the truth was permitted, the entire edifice of Soviet legitimacy would begin to crumble. By 1989, the process had escaped his control. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, which had been crushed by martial law in 1981, had re-emerged. In June, free elections were held. The communists were swept from power. A Solidarity government took office. For the first time since World War II, a Warsaw Pact country had a non-communist government. In Hungary, the Reform Communists opened the border with Austria. In May, a hole appeared in the Iron Curtain. East Germans began traveling to Hungary on vacation and then fleeing west through the open border. Thousands at first, then tens of thousands. The East German government protested. The Hungarians ignored them. Moscow said nothing. In Czechoslovakia, dissidents were organizing. Václav Havel, the playwright who had been imprisoned for his writings, was calling for democracy. The communist government was losing its grip. And in East Germany, the linchpin of the entire system, the front line of the Cold War, the situation was spiraling out of control. Erich Honecker, the hardline leader who had overseen the wall for 18 years, had been forced to resign in October. His successor, Egon Krenz, was trying to implement reforms, but it was too late. The people had lost faith. They wanted freedom. They wanted democracy. They wanted to leave. Every Monday, demonstrations in Leipzig. Peaceful at first, then growing larger, bolder. 70,000 people, 100,000, 300,000, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. The security forces stood by, uncertain. The local party officials called Moscow for guidance. Moscow said, "No violence." Moscow said, "Do not provoke." Moscow said, "We will not intervene." But Moscow did not say what would happen if the demonstrations continued to grow, if the demands escalated, if the wall itself came under threat. And now, on November 9th, 1989, the wall was opening. And Mikhail Gorbachev, sitting alone in his Kremlin study, holding a phone, listening to his advisor describe the chaos unfolding in Berlin, had to decide what kind of leader he would be. "Mikhail Sergeyevich, what should I tell them?" Chernyav's voice on the phone, patient but insistent, waiting for orders, waiting for a decision. Gorbachev stood up, the phone cord stretching as he walked to the window. Outside, the rain had intensified. Water streamed down the glass, distorting the lights of Red Square into abstract patterns. He thought about calling an emergency Politburo meeting, but he knew what would happen. The hardliners would demand intervention. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov would talk about Soviet security interests. KGB Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov would talk about Western manipulation and the threat of counter-revolution. They would invoke Hungary. They would invoke Czechoslovakia. They would invoke the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in World War II, the sacrifice that had purchased Soviet control over Eastern Europe. They would demand that he send the tanks, and they would not be wrong. From a traditional Soviet perspective, from the logic that had governed Soviet foreign policy for 40 years, intervention was the obvious choice. East Germany was too important to lose. The wall was too symbolic to let fall. Soviet credibility was at stake, but Gorbachev had said many times that the Brezhnev doctrine was finished, that the Soviet Union would not impose its will on other countries by force, that each nation had the right to choose its own path. He had said it to Western leaders. He had said it to the Warsaw Pact allies. He had even said it publicly in speeches and interviews. Had he meant it? Or had it just been rhetoric, propaganda, a way to improve relations with the West while maintaining the reality of Soviet control? Tonight was the test. "Anatoly," Gorbachev said slowly, "what is happening at the checkpoints right now?" "People are crossing. East Berliners are walking into West Berlin. The guards have stepped aside. There's no violence. It's peaceful, but chaotic. The crowds are huge. The West Berlin police are overwhelmed. The news is spreading. More people are coming." "And our forces?" "Watching, waiting. The commanders are calling for instructions every 15 minutes. They want to know if they should intervene." Gorbachev was quiet for a long moment. He could hear Cherniav breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the rain against the window, could hear his own heartbeat, steady but heavy. He thought about his grandfather, arrested during Stalin's purges, tortured in a prison cell, confessing to crimes he never committed. He thought about his father, returning from the war with wounds that never fully healed. He thought about Raisa, who had told him just last week that the system was dying, that trying to save it might be impossible, that perhaps the best they could do was manage its collapse with dignity. He thought about the young people in Leipzig, chanting for freedom. He thought about the families divided by the wall for 28 years. He thought about the border guards who had shot people trying to escape, who had followed orders, who had done their duty. He thought about what it meant to be a leader, whether leadership meant maintaining power at any cost, or whether it meant having the courage to let go when holding on would require violence. "Tell them," he said finally, "that we will not intervene. Tell them to remain in their barracks. Tell them to take no action without direct orders from Moscow, and tell them that those orders will not come." There was a pause. When Cherniav spoke again, his voice was very soft. "Mikhail Sergeyevich, you understand what this means?" If we don't act now, the wall will fall. East Germany will fall. The entire Warsaw Pact could collapse. Yes, Gorbachev said. I understand. Yazov and Khrushchev will demand a meeting. They'll argue for intervention. They'll say you're betraying Soviet security. Let them argue. The decision is made. Another pause. Then, history will remember this night. Yes, Gorbachev said quietly. I know. He hung up the phone and stood at the window, watching the rain fall on Red Square. Somewhere in Berlin, thousands of people were crossing from east to west, were experiencing freedom for the first time in their lives. Somewhere in the Kremlin, hardliners were learning of his decision and preparing their opposition. Somewhere in Washington, intelligence analysts were watching the same images he would soon see on television, were trying to understand what it meant, were wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Gorbachev knew the answer. It was the beginning of the end. The end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Empire, perhaps the end of the Soviet Union itself, and he had chosen to let it happen. Not because he wanted the Soviet system to collapse, not because he had lost faith in socialism, but because he understood, with a clarity that came from years of watching the system fail, that some historical forces cannot be resisted, that some changes are inevitable, that trying to hold back history with tanks and guns would only create martyrs and prolong the agony. Within an hour, all the checkpoints were opening. The guards at Checkpoint Charlie, at the Brandenburg Gate, at crossing points all along the wall, they all made the same decision. They stepped aside. They let the people through. On the western side, crowds had gathered too. West Berliners who had heard the news, who had come to witness history. When the first East Berliners crossed, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the cheering began. People embraced strangers. They wept. They opened bottles of champagne. They danced in the streets. The Berlin Wall, that monument to division, that symbol of oppression, that physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, was being breached not by armies or governments, but by ordinary people armed with nothing more than hope and determination. Young people climbed onto the wall itself, standing on the concrete barrier that had divided their city for 28 years. They spray-painted graffiti. They chipped away pieces with hammers and chisels. The wall that had seemed permanent, eternal, unbreakable, was being dismantled by hand. The images were broadcast around the world. CNN showed it live. BBC interrupted regular programming. In living rooms from Tokyo to Los Angeles, from London to Moscow, people watched as history pivoted, as the Cold War's most enduring symbol crumbled in real time. And in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev watched too. He had turned on the television after his call with Chernyaev. Now he sat alone, watching East Berliners stream through the checkpoints, watching people dance on top of the wall, watching the barrier that had defined the Cold War being torn down piece by piece. His face showed no emotion, but inside he felt the weight of what was happening. This was not just the opening of a border. This was the collapse of an empire. This was the end of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. This was the beginning of a process that would ultimately consume the Soviet Union itself. He could still stop it. He could still call Yazov. Could still order Soviet forces to close the checkpoints, to seal the border, to restore the wall. It would mean violence. It would mean deaths, but it would maintain Soviet control. He picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. Then he turned off the television and went to bed. The decision was made. The tanks would not come. The next morning, the emergency Politburo meeting was tense from the moment it began. Defense Minister Yazov sat rigid in his chair, his face flushed with anger. KGB Chairman Khrushchev looked like he hadn't slept. The other members, some reformists, some hardliners, most simply confused, waited to see how the confrontation would unfold. Gorbachev opened the meeting with a simple statement. Comrades, as you know, the Berlin Wall opened last night. East Germans are crossing into West Berlin. Our forces in East Germany have taken no action. I've ordered them to remain in their barracks." Yazov exploded. "Mikhail Sergeyevich, with respect, this is a catastrophe. The wall is the symbol of our control over East Germany. If it falls, East Germany falls. If East Germany falls, the entire Warsaw Pact collapses. We must act immediately. We have the forces. We have the capability. We can close the border within hours." "And if the East Germans resist?" Gorbachev asked calmly. "If they fight back? Do we shoot them?" "If necessary." Yazov's voice was loud, almost shouting. "This is not about East Germany. This is about the security of the Soviet Union. We fought the Great Patriotic War to ensure that Germany could never threaten us again. We paid for that security with 27 million lives, and now you're prepared to throw it away." Khrushchev leaned forward. "The Americans are watching, Mikhail Sergeyevich. NATO is watching. If we show weakness now, they will exploit it. They will push their advantage. They will seek to roll back Soviet influence everywhere. This is exactly what they've wanted since 1945. Eduard Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, responded sharply. "And if we send tanks into Berlin? If we massacre civilians on live television, what then? We will become international pariahs. The arms reduction treaties we've negotiated? Gone. The economic cooperation we need? Gone. The improved relations with the West that are essential to our survival? Gone. We will be back to the worst days of the Cold War, isolated and bankrupt." "Better isolated than destroyed," Khrushchev shot back. "We are already being destroyed." Shevardnadze's voice rose. "Our economy is collapsing. Our people are losing faith in the system. We cannot hold Eastern Europe through force indefinitely. The Brezhnev Doctrine was a mistake. It made us occupiers, not liberators. It made socialism something imposed at gunpoint, not something chosen freely." The argument continued for 2 hours. The hardliners demanded intervention. The reformists urged restraint. The moderates tried to find middle ground, perhaps a negotiated solution, perhaps a gradual transition, perhaps some way to maintain Soviet influence without using force. Gorbachev listened to all of them. He asked questions. He probed their arguments. He let them exhaust themselves. Finally, he spoke. "Comrades, I understand your concerns. I share many of them. But I have made a decision, and that decision stands. We will not intervene in East Germany. We will not send tanks to Berlin. We will not use force to maintain the wall." Yazov started to object. Gorbachev raised his hand. "Let me finish. I have thought about this carefully. I have considered the alternatives, and I know that using force would be a mistake. Not just a moral mistake, though it would be that, but a practical mistake, a strategic mistake." He looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "The Soviet Union cannot survive by holding Eastern Europe at gunpoint. We cannot build socialism by imprisoning people behind walls. We cannot maintain our security by denying others their freedom. These are the methods of an empire, not a union of socialist republics, and empires built on force always collapse in the end." "So you're prepared to let East Germany go?" Khrushchev asked coldly. "To let the wall fall, to let the Warsaw Pact dissolve?" "I'm prepared," Gorbachev said quietly, "to let history unfold. If socialism cannot survive without military occupation, then it does not deserve to survive. If the people of Eastern Europe choose a different path, then that is their right. We can negotiate. We can seek guarantees for our security. We can work with whatever governments emerge, but we will not use force." "You are gambling with the future of the Soviet Union," Yazov said. "Yes," Gorbachev replied, "I am. Because the alternative, sending tanks into Berlin, shooting civilians, trying to hold back history with violence, that is not a gamble. That is a certainty of failure, of isolation, of moral bankruptcy." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "The decision is made, comrades. We will not intervene. History will judge whether I was right or wrong. But I will not be the Soviet leader who orders a massacre in Berlin. I will not be responsible for that. The meeting ended in silence. The hardliners left angry, already planning their opposition. The reformists left relieved but anxious, understanding that they had just witnessed a historic decision but uncertain of its consequences. And Gorbachev remained in the conference room for a moment, alone with his thoughts, knowing that he had just changed the course of history, knowing that the world would never be the same, knowing that he had made the choice that would define his legacy, for better or worse, for all time. Within a year, East Germany would cease to exist, absorbed into a reunified Germany. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, and Gorbachev would be out of power, remembered in Russia as the man who lost an empire, remembered in the West as the man who ended the Cold War peacefully. But on that November night in 1989, standing at his window, watching the rain fall on Red Square, he made the choice that mattered most. He chose peace over power. He chose freedom over control. He chose to let the wall fall. And in doing so, he let the world change.